some streamers are losing hope. some viewers on there are losing hope.
It is rolling.
Okay.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'll use the mic just for the online recording. I think it'll be a little better with it. So welcome everybody. My name's Kolya. Thanks for coming. And this is a event put on by the People's Education Program, which is a collaboration between All Power Books and Midnight Books and other organizers and individuals. And I wanted to start with just some expectations for what this class is going to be about. So we're going to have some lecture mixed with discussion, hopefully quite a lot of discussion. I want it to be fun. We're going to be talking about Marxism, psychoanalysis, but also like movies, TV shows, pop culture, these kinds of things. We are going to cover some, kind of heavy topics too. We're going to be talking about racism, genocide, violence. Part of the reason for that is that I think psychoanalysis actually helps us understand these things in a much deeper sense than the way that we often talk about these things on the left. So I just want to prepare people for these themes that we'll be covering. My goals for this class are to show how fantasy employs all the core psychoanalytic concepts. So we're going to be using the topic of fantasy to understand the basics of psychoanalysis. And I think that the theory of the structure of fantasy and psychoanalysis brings all these concepts together in a way that makes them make sense for us. Secondly, I want to understand how fantasy narratives support capitalist ideology. But also how fantasy narratives can challenge capitalist ideology. So that's going to be an interesting point of discussion in this class. And lastly, I want to show how psychoanalytic theory is both disturbing and liberating for Marxism. So those are the basic goals. And this is going to be a challenging class because psychoanalysis is a very dense theoretical field. But I think I have some help here because what psychoanalysis really does, in my opinion, is it teaches us what we already know. So we already know how important fantasy is in motivating human beings. I think most people would agree that fantasy is a big part of our social reality. You know that genuine satisfaction is elusive. So even when we think we get the thing we wanted, it often comes up short. It leaves us wanting. You know that human beings are contradictory. We do things for reasons that we might not necessarily be conscious of. And we all know that George Bush really meant it a couple of years ago when he condemned the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. Ukraine. So this slip that everybody watched, he got laughs for this, right? Because I think everyone in the room recognized he's really talking about himself. He's not talking about Vladimir Putin. He's calling attention to his own crimes here. And I think this is an unconscious act by George Bush in this case. So we notice these things all the time. And I think a psychoanalyst just appreciates all of these facts and puts them into a systemic theory to help us understand what these things tell us about ourselves as human beings. Now, I want to start with a few questions to get people kind of warmed up. And I want to hear some of your opinions about these questions to introduce this class. So, what are some of the common critiques of Freud that we always hear about? And since we're a pretty small group today, I think we can just leave it as an open question. You guys can just raise your hand and answer as you see fit. What are some of the big ones?
I've heard he's
Yeah.
sexist, he's a reactionary. He's obviously been adapted by the right wing. So.
Okay, so his ideas have been kind of appropriated by the right wing. He's been considered sexist, reactionary. Okay.
Like overly focused on like sexual stuff and family
Yeah.
and
Reductive. Like everything is just about sex and your childhood trauma and your family. Yeah.
He's called a pseudoscientist in psychology, so not necessarily grounded in like actual theory or scientific approach. He was discredited for that.
Right. He's unscientific. We went through the same psychology degree program. And this is the only thing they tell you really, is that Freud was unscientific. It's the main talking point, right?
Kind of coming back to that, but his ideas are too grounded in his own kind of opinions and experiences rather than empirical data.
Yeah, he did a lot of case studies with individuals. And he even wrote a book where he used his own grandson as like a case in point. It was his book, very important book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But he didn't reveal that it was his grandson. But people look at that and they say, well, how do we know, you're telling the truth here? Yeah.
I've heard that, I've heard critiques of Freud that he was pretty Eurocentric, since he only really took the experiences of the European people around him and then used it to create a theory of all of human nature.
Right. So could this really be a universal theory of human subjectivity if he's just operating out of Europe? Yeah, that's a good one.
Like in a clinical practice setting, like we had that idea of like a blank screen approach. So there wasn't a lot of I guess like what you would say now is like that therapeutic relationship.
Okay, what do you mean? What's the distinction between the blank screen and the therapeutic relationship?
Like he was like a blank screen, like there wasn't as much emphasis on like the relationship between like therapist.
Right, so the patient is just kind of projecting onto the...
Yeah.
And he's just absorbing their...
Yeah, and like that idea of like he's the expert as opposed to like
Okay,
the person sitting across from him.
Got you. Okay, so it's a little bit of a one-way relationship in his therapeutic setting. Okay. I think there's other ones. I mean, one of the ones we didn't get to is, I think a lot of leftists take issue with Freud because it reduces social problems to individual pathologies. Your neurosis should be taken as your own pathology as opposed to a reflection of a broader societal phenomenon. I think this is sometimes a legitimate critique of psychoanalysis in general, in the way it's practiced, especially in the therapeutic setting where it's just a one-on-one dialectical relationship. It sort of ignores the broader social ills. Okay, that's good. What do you think would be a Marxist theory of psychology? So if we're, sitting here on the left, there's all these different theories of psychology. What is our theory of psychology?
I would
Yeah.
say your psychology is dependent on the material conditions.
Okay, right. So explain that a little more.
So if you're born into a situation where you are economically impoverished, you don't have consistent needs to necessary resources to survive, like water, food, electricity, housing, that's going to affect your psychological state.
Right. Yeah, very good. Marxists are interested in the material conditions. And so however much research you do on the psychology that you see people exhibiting under capitalism, well, that's just still going to be limited to what the parameters of psychology can be under capitalism. Anyone else? Yeah.
Out of El Salvador, there's liberation psychology. So Ignacio Martin Bottom, he talks about how psychology should come from the marginalized, not for them. So it shouldn't be top down. It should be more bottom up.
So rather than a gift from middle-class academics to poor people, psychology should really take the experiences of poor people as a starting point.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't heard of that. That's the goal. Any other? Do we need a theory of psychology on the left? You know, it's an interesting question, right? I think it's sort of a blind spot in a way. I mean, Marx had a few things to say about, you know, how he saw human psychology playing out under capitalism, which we sort of run with on the left. But do we really have a fully developed theory?
Just thinking about the Frankfurt School and how one of their main goals was to merge some psychology and Marxism into something that can help them in this new stage of capitalism post-World War II, right?
Right, yeah, the Frankfurt School was really an important institution that tried to use some of the 20th century philosophy, including psychoanalysis, to understand the failure of the revolution in the West. Why wasn't there a revolution in Europe or the United States? Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you can describe it as a theory of psychology, but the idea of alienation, the idea that human being is something that is kind of pushed away from the human being because of the pressures of capitalist society, the idea that you're not able to follow your kind of basic instincts because of the way that society is structured around you. So even if it is in your own worst interest, there's certain things that people just won't do because of what their conditions are.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a really important term, alienation. I think this is where Marx gets closest to developing the theory of psychology under capitalism. So, and I think this term alienation becomes what he refers to as commodity fetishism when he develops his theory of capitalism later in his career. So he believes that our desire is sort of distorted under capitalism. And that, yeah, what you're saying, like our true desire goes through this prism of capitalism and becomes this distorted thing where instead of a relationship between people, we have a relationship between commodities. And people even become commodities for each other. This is a really important insight from Marx. And what psychoanalysis, I think, does is say, not that we wouldn't have alienation, you know, from our own labor, from each other, if capitalism weren't here, but that capitalism actually gives us a bad substitute for a much deeper alienation. It prevents us from getting in touch with our alienation. It's actually a distortion of our alienation rather than a distortion of our true desire. I think that's what psychoanalysis would say. And psychoanalysis would say that desire always takes a detour. There is no true desire. And we're going to talk about what that means in a second. What is ideology? What does that word mean to you guys? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Everything is ideology.
Okay, good. Everything is ideology. All right.
But like more formally, I guess it's just a set of formalized ideas.
Okay.
Very broadly.
Okay. A set of formalized ideas.
I was going to say, it's your theory of how everything works, or maybe even how it should be, how to explain everything.
Yeah, theory of how everything works. A theory to explain everything. I like that. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
I think when I think of ideology, I think of like the word ideal, or like something that you think it's like a way of seeing things that's based on sort of facts that you have, things that you cling to that you think are true beyond a doubt.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, Gabe, you had said the way things should be, and we have this idea of certainty about the way things are. Okay, I think one of the ways that we talk about ideology, which isn't the way we mean it in psychoanalysis and in Marxism, is ideology is just anyone's ideas about anything. It's just people's opinions. But no, I think the way we're going to use it today is by ideology we mean the ruling ideology. The ruling ideology. And what ideology does, first and foremost, is it papers over the contradictions of society. It explains why things are the way they are. And it tells us that things should be the way they already are. So I just want to make it clear that when I say ideology, I'm not referring to one person's ideas or one group's ideas. I'm referring to the ruling ideas of society. And last question here. What is it about fantasies that makes them interesting to us?
You're escaping reality.
Okay, good. We're escaping reality. Sometimes reality is overwhelming, right?
Maybe it's like a space to imagine or try out new things that you haven't actually done in the real world yet. It's kind of do a trial run of things in your mind.
Right. You imagine possibilities that are not possible yet, maybe, but could be possible. Yeah. Good.
Sometimes it could be unfortunately, like a good coping mechanism.
Okay, coping mechanism. Kind of escapist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They kind of in that gray zone, kind of in religiosity, where it's based with some reality, but can give you some supernatural thing that you might desire in reality.
Right. So it has to be anchored to reality in a way, but yeah, it allows us to access some beyond reality.
Yeah, I was gonna say like spending time in a fantasy like could change how you interpret like the current like your normal life or something. It could change the way you look at what you just normally would see.
Yeah, very good. Very good. That's actually a kind of a core principle of the psychoanalytic theory of fantasy, is that it helps us understand our reality. Okay, these are good. I think, maybe even worth mentioning is sometimes fantasies can be the thing we need to escape from. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, right? Fantasy itself can become traumatic, and it requires an escape. Okay, good. These are really good answers. I wanted to also go through some of the jargon terms that are going to come up in this class. So we're going to be talking about desire and fantasy. I think these we understand. We have a vernacular meaning for what these words refer to. But for some of these, we're really going to need the psychoanalytic jargon definition, even though we think we've heard these words before. So we're going to be talking about subject and subjectivity, the unconscious, repression and displacement. We're going to be talking about the symptom, ideology, the big other, enjoyment, death drive or just drive, objet a, and symbolic castration. No psychoanalysis lecture would be complete without a reference to symbolic castration. So when these terms come up, I'm going to do my best to give kind of the jargon definition. But if I'm using any of these terms and you don't feel like you have a good grasp of what it is, please, raise your hand and we'll try to go over it again, because it's really important that we understand what we're referring to in this class. One of the inspirations for this class was actually a podcast episode by the Red Nation. And Nick Estes, Elena Ortiz, and Sina Ramani discuss John Ford's The Searchers. And the episode they discuss this film in is every cowboy story is a confession. It's a great episode. And actually, every episode where they talk about movies, I try to listen to because they're all really good. And they're all really psychoanalytic, even though they're not psychoanalysts, or they wouldn't call themselves psychoanalysts. So The Searchers is a 1956 Western film starring John Wayne. And it depicts the final years of what Wikipedia calls the Texas Indian War in the 1870s. Sort of how the West was won. And John Wayne plays Ethan Edwards, who is a Confederate Army veteran, who, cut his teeth defending the system of slavery in the South, and now he's dabbling in some ethnic cleansing in Texas in the narrative of this film. Now, there's some absurd things about this movie, and Nick Estes is very clear about what some of those absurdities are. But at the same time, it is a great film, I think. It is a great work of fantasy. Actually, it's kind of a national treasure. So the Library of Congress put this film in the National Film Archive. And I think that that's significant. And I think Nick Estes is right in the podcast when he makes no distinction between this film and the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. He refers to both of these things as canonical texts in American society. And they're foundational, he thinks, to the construction of, American fantasy and what the American project means. And I think it's a very psychoanalytic point because he's identifying ideology and fantasy as participating wrapped up in the same project. So ideology, the Constitution, and fantasy, the Searchers, the American Western film. These are both instrumental in reproducing the social relations of this country. There's a great quote by another podcaster that I am very inspired by, Todd McGowan. He's a psychoanalyst. He has a podcast called Why Theory. And he says that what happens to you phantasmatically is just as important as what happens to you in reality. And I think he would actually go further. And he does go further, and he says fantasy is actually more important in many ways than reality for human beings. So in other words, no one has read the Constitution. Okay, but everyone knows who John Wayne is. I think that's significant. I think that shows you the importance of fantasy in the narratives that we weave in our collective society. Does anyone know this Instagram duo, the Good Liars? They troll right-wing rallies, interview people, and they act like serious journalists. And they're these very buttoned-down white guys, but so people approach them, and then they end up divulging much more than they were hoping to in these videos. No one's heard of these guys. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. We're gonna play a clip just to give a sense of what was that?
No, I was just asking, what are they called?
The Good Liars.
Good Liars.
Yeah, the Good Liars. I think I can probably make it work. Let's see here. Let's see.
What do you feel about the people here protesting Donald Trump?
Well, I feel like everybody should have something to say, but this is a Trump rally. If you don't like it, don't come here to protest. Don't come if you're uneducated and you don't know what you're talking about.
You would rather they just didn't come here?
I would rather them not come here.
Are you a fan of the First Amendment?
Absolutely. The right to bear arms. Look, this is...
That's not the First Amendment.
No. The Fourth Amendment.
All right, so what we're seeing is evidence of what I just said, that no one has actually read the Constitution. I mean, even though we haven't, we kind of know what some of these amendments are, hopefully. Let's see. But I also want to say, she's not totally wrong about not caring exactly what all the amendments she's kind of right about something fundamental, which is that the Constitution is boring. Nobody wants to just walk around reciting the Constitution. That's not how you create a society, by just memorizing a Constitution. She wants to be a part of a political project that she finds interesting, right? That gives her a reason to live. And I think that that is what Trump does very effectively. He's not giving people, talking points that they need to adhere to. He's giving people a point of identification, right? That gives them a sense of meaning, a sense of identity, a fantasy to believe it. How many of you knew that one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence is about Britain's failure to protect the colonies from merciless Indian savages? That's still in the Declaration of Independence, in our Constitution. So this is the reality of the Constitution. And I think it's John Wayne who takes on this imagined burden and makes it into a spectacle in the Western fantasy. We said earlier that ideology, as understood both by Marxists and psychoanalysis, is an attempt to paper over the systemic contradictions in society. But where psychoanalysis proceeds further than Marxism is in its claim that ideology cannot assert itself over society without fantasy. And, let me get back to my full screen here. Just that one. I can't see. There we go. So I made a modified version of this meme, which I hope makes the point here. Fantasy is a powerful substance in our society. And actually, I like this quote from Slavoj Žižek, another psychoanalyst that inspires me quite a bit. He says, fantasy allows us to, in a way, enjoy our ideology. I have a picture of him here. Might look familiar to some of you. Now, importantly, and I referenced this earlier, it's often difficult to stomach some of our fantasies. They don't necessarily make us feel good, but they do always make us feel something. And this something is often more complicated than simple pleasure. And I think it's also the thing that drives us to fantasize in the first place. So the trick of the ideological fantasy is to conceal the source of this ambivalent feeling. In fantasy, and this is another quote from Todd McGowan, we are blinded to form by the light of content. So we're blinded to the structure of our fantasy. We're blinded by what the fantasy is really doing for us and how it's built by the richness of its surface, all the details of the fantasy. So the ideological fantasy is a masterful exercise in censorship. And figuring out what exactly is being censored exposes the ideological work being done in fantasy. So we take fantasy seriously. We're emotionally attached to our fantasies. And we have a difficult time analyzing our fantasies from the position of the person fantasizing. And this all makes fantasy a very powerful source of support for the capitalist political project. Now, with this being said, we're going to talk about some of the basics of psychoanalysis to help us understand why we fantasize and what fantasy is really doing for the human subject. Marx's thesis was that society is divided into antagonistic classes, producing a class struggle that puts history into motion, and that this struggle opens the way for the dictatorship of the proletariat. And if we don't accept this part of Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat, we aren't Marxists, in my opinion. We need Marx's theory of political economy, and we need the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think those are the two core aspects of Marxism. And I'm saying this because my investigation into psychoanalysis is my attempt to better theorize the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think it does help us do that. It gives us a clearer idea of what that could actually look like in practice, given the material we're working with, which is human beings. And I wanted to include this meme because, for me, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not just a social project. It's also my retirement plan. So I try to make sure I'm surrounded by people who are also talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So for Marx, subjectivity is greatly determined by the historical mode of production. But the subject can develop consciousness, and by subject and subjectivity, let's define that as the experience of being human. Subjectivity. The subject can develop consciousness and act to change the conditions of production and therefore transform the subject themselves. So Marx didn't just see capitalism as this over-determining force in society. He also believed that human subjects can develop consciousness and transform the mode of production, which can then transform the field of possibility for social relations. So there was a dialectical relationship that he saw playing out between society and the subject. For psychoanalysis, a similar dialectic plays out within the individual, within the human subject. So whereas Marxism analyzes the contradictions in society and the dialectic between society and the subject, psychoanalysis theorizes the contradictory process happening within the subject themselves. So the subject for psychoanalysis is a split subject. And in the Hegelian sense, what this means is that the subject fails to be identical with itself. So Marx's claim was the ruling class fails to be identical with itself because it is absolutely dependent on the working class. There is no ruling class in the abstract. It always needs the working class for it to have an identity. Now, for psychoanalysis, the subject fails to be identical with itself. We are not self-identical as subjects because consciousness is mediated through and undermined by the activity of the unconscious. So we are split between the conscious and unconscious aspects of ourselves. Now, what does being a split subject mean in practice? It means that we are subjects of the symptom. And the symptom is an absolutely core concept in psychoanalysis. So Freud's main idea was that the subject is split between consciousness and the unconscious. And the unconscious has desires, right, that conflict with consciousness. The unconscious has desires that conflict with consciousness. And the unconscious desire wishes to express itself, but it can't fully express itself without facing repression from consciousness, resistance from consciousness. And this produces a clash between the unconscious and consciousness, which takes the form of a symptom. So the symptom is the compromise. It's a compromise formation in Freud's terms between the unconscious and consciousness. And for Freud, the unconscious desire is unable to express itself save in a distorted form. So the unconscious is only ever present to us in the form of a symptom. To put it in Zizek's terminology, there is no repressed content before the return of the repressed. So we can't identify some pure unconscious desire. We can only get in touch with the unconscious through this distorted form of the unconscious desire in the form of a symptom. I wanted to give an example of this, distortion and displacement in Hollywood. So in 1955, we had the brutal murder of a teenager from Chicago who was visiting his family in Mississippi. This was Emmett Till. And his family insisted on an open casket funeral to sort of demand a response from America. It was covered in the news media, and this picture was proliferated widely in the country. And it was seen by Rod Serling, who we know as the writer of the Twilight Zone sci-fi series. And he tried to tell the story of Emmett Till immediately, he was already a television writer, and he wanted to tell the story immediately. And he changed a couple details, but he basically kept the story intact, which might have been possible, but he went on TV, and in a live interview, he admitted that this TV episode was going to be the story of Emmett Till. And there was a racist backlash by America. All sorts of letters went into the network saying, we don't want to see this, don't let this happen. And he was forced to filter his ideas, water them down, dumb them down to the point where this episode didn't even look like what he wanted to write. And he learned from this that you can't just expose America to itself. You have to trick America in a certain way. And that's what ended up driving him to write the Twilight Zone series, which is a sweeping sci-fi series that critiques America in many of the ways he wanted to critique it, but in a distorted way, in a way that doesn't directly confront the horrors of America. It is a symptom, you could say, of his desire to tell a certain story. So I think that's a nice example of a symptom in our social reality. So there's no pure manifestation of desire. Desire can only ever express itself as a symptom. And we can see that this process is at play not just in private fantasies and neuroses, but in social fantasies depicted in film and media. I also think, and I wonder if you'll follow me here, that we could think of the state itself as a symptom, as the outcome of a struggle between social forces. Capitalist relations, community relations, the mature form of which we might call socialism, and the totality of all the social contradictions in society. And the outcome of this clash of forces presents itself in America today as a symptom, as a distortion of repressed community desires under a capitalist state. And isn't this gesture that we saw 4 years ago by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in response to the George Floyd rebellion, isn't this gesture a symptom, a perverse symptom of the distortion of the desires, the demands of these protests? Distorted by the sheer weight of capitalist repression that will not allow the demands of these protests to express themselves in a pure form, right? It has to go through this capitalist state system and express itself in this absolutely twisted way that is a shadow of what the original community demands were. So the symptom is a product of repression and displacement, and the ideological fantasy is an act of displacement. And as revolutionaries, we should be interested in interpreting the ideological fantasy as a symptom. So Nick Estes believes that the anxieties surrounding the truth of the frontier, for example, the genocide of Native Americans, reappear as a symptom in American cinema. And this isn't just the case with Westerns. He calls this phenomena colonial realism, and he uses the example of Halloween, the John Carpenter film from 1978, as an example of colonial realism. So in Halloween, it's easier to imagine that what haunts suburbia is an unstoppable 6'5" guy with a knife and a creepy mask, right? Than it is to accept that suburbia is haunted by our nation's history of genocide. So Mike Myers is sort of a symptom of the repression of America's real history. So, it emerges in these strange fantasy monsters in Hollywood cinema. And he points out, what is Michael Myers supposed to be? He's wearing this, mechanics outfit. Are we really scared of mechanics? Obviously there's something else going on here. And he points out that the mask he wears is actually a Captain Kirk mask, who's sort of like the quintessential American man, right? So I think it's white violence, right? That's reemerging here in this figure of Michael Myers, who is haunting suburbia. You know, suburbia is too quiet. There's something disturbing out there. We can't quite put our finger on it, even though if we read some history, we might have to confront the fact that suburbia is only possible because of the genocide. But we can tell ourselves this fantasy narrative about Michael Myers being the thing that really haunts the American middle class. The zombie film. Nick Estes also talks about the zombie film as a reprisal of the Western fantasy, where, you know, we can't depict the same old cowboys and Indians drama in contemporary America. So, you know, the zombie replaces the merciless savage on the frontier, and the survivors cosplay as frontier settlers, right? I thought it was an interesting theory that he had about that. So these are symptoms, right, that emerge from what is repressed in society and what society will allow to emerge in popular cinema. So the ideological fantasy is organized displacement in service of the reproduction of society as it is. And we are given a conservative fantasy to enjoy, one that often feels subversive, so that we can continue to be good capitalist subjects. Did you guys follow the Imani Khalif story from the Olympics? This was an Olympic boxer who, does someone want to just tell us kind of what that controversy was about? Someone remembers that?
So, Imani Khalif was a Algerian, or is an Algerian boxer who's a female. There's no controversy there, but her opponent, who I believe was Italian, got beat up really bad within like 50 seconds and then started crying and saying, oh, she's actually a man. Not true. She had no proof. She had no idea. But the right wing and, you know, just crazy people picked it up and started pushing that this was actually a trans athlete that they allowed to fight, but then everything's come back. No, it's just a woman that beat you up really bad.
Right. Right, exactly. She ended up winning the gold. Pretty cool. But yeah, it created this massive right-wing backlash worldwide, and particularly here in America. Now, why do you guys think that people feel subversive for attacking an athlete like Imani Khalif? Because don't you think, like, people don't just think they're, you know, following the social authority, right? They think they're being rebellious when they condemn this athlete for getting away with whatever it is, being high testosterone or something, or secretly being a man. Why do people feel subversive when they engage in this kind of discourse? Yeah.
Because they're sold the fantasy of the things that oppress in society, the things that make their lives bad, rather than being their economic conditions. It's the trans people or these minorities or the Jews or whatever.
Right. And what do you think is rebellious or subversive about that for this group of people that is blaming these groups for their problems?
So I think of the narrative that's being sold to you is that that there is this cultural shift happening, and that the elites or whoever it is that you believe is in control of society are trying to force this kind of new cultural movement over your head. Then by saying, oh no, I won't accept this, I won't accept that these minorities are becoming integrated, then you're being subversive, you're countercultural, you're standing up for yourself. Even though in reality that's the opposite of what's happening.
Right. Yeah, so they think this is an elite project, right? This infiltration of transgender people into every aspect of our lives. Gender-neutral bathrooms, textbooks in school that depict members of, you know, non-binary communities, things like this. There's a whole, you know, right-wing education reform movement that takes aim at this sort of quote-unquote elite capture of our schools to force these ideas upon our children. Yeah. Any other reflections on that?
I guess, can you say more about why you're positive that they feel that it is subversive?
Well, I think, I said that an ideological fantasy has to feel subversive for it to work. So, like, in The Searchers, John Wayne is doing all these extremely violent acts that you wouldn't necessarily call legal, right? But he's doing them, and we'll talk about this more soon, but he's doing them in a way that actually does follow the social authority. But it's important that they appear subversive, because that's very important for fantasy to work. We'll talk about that more soon. But I'm kind of introducing this idea that, there is a subversive element even to dominant ideological fantasies. I think that they think this is the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? I mean, they think Kamala Harris is a communist, a Marxist. Donald Trump just said this, right? So this crowd, this particularly right-wing crowd, which is not necessarily the dominant viewpoint in America, I want to make that clear. But they believe that this is the dictatorship of the proletariat, that it's looming. On November 5th, this could be our future. And what they miss is the very thing that I talked about earlier, which is that this is just a perverse symptom, a pale shadow of the demands of a movement that actually takes human rights seriously, that takes human dignity seriously. Don't worry, guys, we're not very close to having human dignity in America, right? If they took a moment to look at the statistics about what life is like for trans people in America, how many more times likely they are to attempt suicide, the poverty rates, the income levels for transgender people, I think they would have to recognize that this is not a dominant group and that it's not that subversive to attack this group. So they shouldn't actually think they're engaged in a subversive act. And if they looked closely, I think what they would realize is that they're merely following the dictates of the big other. Now, we could take a little break here. I want to give people a chance to kind of reset, use the bathroom, walk around for a second. So let's take a 5-minute break and come back at 7:46. We'll keep going from there.
Yeah, right there too. That water is for everybody as well. Do you need water, Corey?
Yeah, actually, I could use one. Thanks. Yeah.
No, yeah, I started it.
She does it.
Is it
related to Midnight Press at all?
Yeah, those are our books over there. Not all of them,
Which ones?
the Layla book, there's a few of them.
Like, one of my professors was telling me about like, this. There's another bookstore I think with a similar name over in Santa Monica back in the 80s.
Oh, Midnight Special.
Midnight Special. Yeah. Is it related to that?
No, the spiritual successor. I did take the name.
Okay. I do like the
Yeah.
main guy.
Yeah,
do
yeah.
you know who Marty is? He goes by Green Grass, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he told me to say hi.
No way. Are you guys? Where are you guys school?
He goes to college now, Occidental.
Occidental.
I'm
Yeah.
a freshman there as well, so that's awesome.
Sick. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
I like him a lot. But he was supposed to come here, but I think he was busy. So.
Yeah. He's done several like book club presentations here.
Oh yeah.
Ooh, very cool guy.
Yeah, I've been trying to like help him facilitate a meeting with an Oxy.
Oh, sick.
Yeah.
You guys all awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And he has a wife. Has he told you about?
Yes. He's my brother.
Yeah. I didn't know you got the name from an 80s bookstore in Santa Monica. It was around since that's pretty cool. Oh, wow. But legendary guy. Zizek was there.
Oh, was he?
Like every name you could think of, Parenti, Chomsky, they all did readings or science.
Root?
Yeah.
What happened to it?
They went away like early 2000s, just. Well, I mean, it had been around for 40 years.
It's a good run.
Yeah. But yeah, so I did name it to kind of carry on. And I still get like, kind of elders that come and say, "Do you remember?" Yeah. That's cool. That's cool. You did your research.
Want some chips?
I'm good, thanks. Appreciate it.
Getting ready for the debate.
I'm closing off all discussions as a debate section.
Are you calling like a huge Freud fan? Or
Yeah.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. Oh, that we lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this Marxist psychoanalytic writer, Anna Kornberg.
Anna what?
You know her?
Anna what?
Anna Kornberg.
That sounds familiar.
She was once asked if you could go back and meet either Marx or Freud, who would you meet?
She said Freud?
She said Freud. I think my answer would be Marx, so that I could tell him about Freud.
Alright. I had some of his books here. I don't know if you've met Scott Bowles. You would love him. He was in DSA Long Beach and he was like making it radical.
Okay.
But then he just couldn't take DSA's like national DSA silliness, so he left. But yeah, he's an amazing organizer. He's a professor at UCI.
Oh, really?
He talks about this stuff a lot too.
Oh, really?
He's donated like hundreds of books here, and it's a lot on that. Yeah. Someday.
All right, guys. I think we'll get started again. If you want to grab your seats.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I know that. I'm involved with like churches organizing them, and they have their posters up everywhere, but we never see them at like actual, events. Like they're not on the streets.
Pontificate. But no, I messed up. They're on the streets, but
What's this? What's going on? Who is this dude?
they positively.
It's been years.
Content here.
All right, y'all. Okay, so I left off saying that even though these ideological fantasies might feel subversive, they actually are just following the dictates of the big other. And the big other we can think of as the psychoanalytic term for ideology. So it is the socially constituted authority that's only made legitimate by our collective participation in its logic. And there's two facets to the big other that I want to go over here. It's official demand and its desire. Now, I don't have a glossary of terms. We're not going to do like one-liner definitions for these terms. You know, I've been studying psychoanalysis for years, and these terms, these jargon terms, keep taking on new dimensions for me. So we're going to try to just construct the definitions of these terms as we go through. So the big other has two facets. It's official demand and its desire. So we could think of the demand of the big other, the demand of ideology, as kind of the law, the official law. But the law in itself is rarely enough to safeguard the project, the real project of the big other, of ideology. So there's a gap in the law. In other words, the big other itself is lacking. And this gap opens up the space for subjects to fantasize a way to repair the lack in the big other. And the law must sometimes be broken to follow the greater law, which is the desire of the big other. And we are always interpreting the desire of the big other, the desire of ideology. What does ideology want from us? And what we determine that it wants is a sacrifice. The big other always demands a sacrifice by its subjects to keep its fiction intact. And we keep the big other intact by taking on the burden of its lack. So, you know, John Wayne in The Searchers, we could return to this example. He's going beyond the law to ensure the protection of the American national project. You know, in the film, he's like shooting at buffalo, right? To make sure that the Comanche tribe can't eat that thing. He's shooting at retreating Native Americans in the battles with them, right? He's going above and beyond. He's engaging in excessive acts of violence that go beyond what the law would demand. Because he's interpreting the desire of the Constitution rather than its stated laws. He's interpreting the desire that America must be established at any cost. And he's taking up this burden to make sure that this happens. And I think we could think of another example that many of us might be able to relate to. So have any of you ever been like at a dinner table where the patriarch of your family is about to tell an inappropriate joke or story? And you feel this, you know, deep compulsion to act and intervene to make sure he doesn't tell this joke. Because you know it's going to diminish his legitimacy as an authority figure in that setting. And so to protect the legitimacy of this patriarch, you're like, no, maybe we'll talk about that another time, right? This authority is only as good as our intervention to make sure it stays a legitimate authority. That is really how the big other functions. It depends on our sacrifice for its legitimacy. So an ideological fantasy attempts to fix the lack in the big other by identifying imagined enemies that threaten to undermine its project. So these perceived enemies, such as the illegal immigrant, the woke mob, you know, whoever that police helicopter at 3 a.m. is looking for outside my apartment in Koreatown. These imagined enemies function as the obstacle in the ideological fantasy, as what prevents the fantasy object, the object of desire in our fantasy, from ultimately satisfying us. right? America would be perfect. It's a great idea, except for these obstacles that emerge in the form of the illegal immigrant who's taking away our jobs, of the androgynous female athlete that's getting an unfair advantage in the sports world, and waging a war on men, right? Okay, so the obstacle is a very important concept in the psychoanalytic theory of fantasy. So within every fantasy, there's an obstacle in the way of our object of desire. And the fantasy narrative swirls around the obstacle rather than the object of desire. Earlier we asked the question, what makes fantasies interesting? And I liked a lot of the answers. I think what a psychoanalyst would say is it's the obstacle in the fantasy that makes the fantasy interesting. Because we need something worthy of escaping to, right? If we want to escape from reality, let's say, into fantasy. What makes fantasy better than reality? Well, I think what makes the fantasy interesting for us is this obstacle in the way of our object of desire. So without the obstacle, we would have no fantasy. The subject requires an obstacle for a fantasy to appear in the first place. So the obstacle actually emerges even before the fantasy, before the object of desire appears in the fantasy. We don't even know how to desire until we have an obstacle. And in his book, The Impossible David Lynch, I keep referencing Todd McGowan, he's a big influence for me. He wrote this great book. If you're a fan of David Lynch and you're interested in psychoanalysis, you must read this book, The Impossible David Lynch. It's the best book on David Lynch. And what it tells me is that either David Lynch is a card-carrying, Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalyst, or psychoanalysis is just a true theory. So in his film Eraserhead, David Lynch depicts the narrative of this character, played by John Nance, whose story is split between fantasy and pure desire without fantasy. And in the beginning of the film, he is stumbling around. You can barely see it on here, but it's kind of the way that it's depicted in the film too. It's this dark, kind of desolate industrial landscape that this character is stumbling through. He's looking over his shoulder. He doesn't know what he should be desiring. He's in this absolutely bleak environment. And it's not until an obstacle emerges in his life that he suddenly begins to fantasize, that he knows what to desire. And the obstacle, if you've seen the film, is his ex-girlfriend lets him know that she's pregnant with something. And so this fatherly responsibility emerges as an obstacle that then allows him to fantasize about all the things he could have if not for this obstacle of the fatherly responsibility. So he begins to sexually fantasize about his neighbor in the apartment next door. He pictures this, heavenly apparition in his radiator, singing this beautiful song. All these fantasies start emerging once he has an obstacle that he can allow the fantasy to operate around. So the obstacle produces the web of drama that makes our fantasies interesting. And in the ideological fantasy, the big other is what determines our object of desire and our obstacle. That's what makes a fantasy ideological. So the obstacle is presented as a figure that does not fit within the social structure of the big other. The big other is saying, look, we would have a complete society if not for this obstacle, this figure that I'm going to consider an obstacle. So with this in mind, I'm interested in what you all think might be the structure of the capitalist fantasy. you know, if we think of a classic capitalist fantasy, what might occupy these positions in such a fantasy? Yeah, here.
I mean, like, the object of desire would be wealth, financial stability, and you know, being able to take care of yourself. And the obstacle that would be, you know, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, getting a job, working your way up to the top, like, and that idea of working for nothing and getting something, that is kind of the American dream, that is the fantasy.
Yeah, isn't all of that like grind set stuff on Instagram? Like, none of it is about the car that they end up wanting to buy. It's all about like working more hours. Like that becomes the point of their whole mission, right? Yeah.
That's pretty much what I was gonna say. Yeah, just like in like a white suburban sense, like owning a home or whatever. Yeah, I mean, basically that.
Yeah, like the white picket fence. That's our object of desire. But what are some other obstacles that could emerge there? Yeah.
Well, I had a slightly different take. I was gonna say the object of desire is infinite growth, leading to continuing to get a new iPhone and all that. And the obstacle that they don't want to admit is that this is a finite planet.
Okay, good. So, but that would not be admitted into the capitalist fantasy, right? That would be an obstacle that we're going to talk about later. That fantasy has to paper over with its own imagined obstacle. But yeah, I think that real obstacle is what generates the fantasy, because the real obstacle is too traumatic to really admit into our fantasy. Did you have a hand up?
Oh yeah, I think I was also thinking of the object of desire as infinite growth. And then for me, the obstacle would be like the governments that are like the regulations in countries, the environmental protection agencies, sort of that.
Right. Regulations. Yeah, too much government interference.
I think one way that I think about this as well is having the object of desire be like human connection, and the obstacle being like our like lacking of a certain product or
Nice. Yeah, I like that a lot.
If I only had the new iPhone, then my friends would like me.
Right. See, yeah, the lack of the right commodity could actually be in the position of obstacle, and something that all of us might agree on as a valid object of desire, like human connection, could be still the object of desire in capitalist fantasy. Yeah.
I was also thinking on the first question, I guess it depends who you are. If you're like a billionaire capitalist, the obstacle would probably be like workers' rights and environmental regulations. But also, if you're well, yeah, I guess it depends who you are, but like, I forget the second part I was mentioning.
Yeah, workers' rights. That's an obstacle, right, to capital accumulation.
Oh, I was gonna say like a Trump supporter. Maybe their object of desire is like 1950s America, and the obstacle is like all these communist kind of ideologies in America.
Yeah, all these inconvenient social movements that happened since then. Yeah. Did I see another hand? Or? Yeah, these are all really good. How about like the American dream? I think that was live. Yeah. American exceptionalism. Obviously a little bit related, but what could we think of as like the American national project? What sort of fantasy is being concocted here?
It's what you said earlier. This is a land of opportunity. Anybody could break gold.
Right, but not everybody does. So what's stopping success from reaching everybody's bank account? Or
Because kind of the idea that's central to capitalism is the myth of meritocracy, right? It's that you have to be exceptional, and that if you're not succeeding, then that's because you're just not good enough. You're just not creative or tough or hardworking enough to break through. And I guess that kind of personal grit might be the obstacle that's blocking you from the object of desire. It's really
Yeah.
the framework of fantasy.
Laziness. Yeah, I like that.
It could also be like Russia or China or North Korea, the migrants stealing the jobs.
Yeah, and I think you know, I've been going to these If We Burn book clubs, all our books recently. They played a video of Barack Obama justifying the invasion of Libya in 2011. And don't you think, like, part of America's vision is that everywhere could be America, if not for the Muammar Gaddafis of the world. Right? These pesky leaders that have different ideas about who should control their national resources. Yeah, so I think, you know, part of the American project is to expand these values everywhere, but then we confront obstacles that become, you know, ideological obstacles that end up justifying things like U.S. interventions. Now, what would make some of these fantasies racist? You know, what would we think of in the position of obstacle or object of desire in a racist fantasy?
Some of the MAGA thinking of, you know, take us back to when America was great, and you know, it's a horrible fantasy.
Just the object of desire itself being like 1950s suburbia or whatever, itself is kind of already racist. Yeah, even without mentioning anything else. Yeah, any other ideas? Oh, okay. No worries. Todd McGowan wrote a book called The Racist Fantasy, where, you know, it's part of my inspiration for this question. He says that a fantasy is racist when we position a racial other as our obstacle. So that's what it means to fantasize in racist terms. And, you know, I'm sure we could all think of a million examples of this, including the Trump movement. But I'm almost more interested in, what about the Pelosi-Schumer fantasy? You know, it's obvious to pick on the super right-wing crowd. But isn't this also sort of its own kind of racist fantasy? And in what sense could we think of this liberal racist fantasy as a racist fantasy?
I mean, I suppose that one way you could look at it is that the other is still, the obstacle is still perceived as a racial other or as a class other, and that what is preventing them from achieving their goals or continuing with, you know, status as usual is these protesters and people who are angry about the status quo. And so despite the fact that they're presenting in this kind of performative activist sense, in reality what they're trying to do through this action is still overcome the anger of the masses and the anger and reaction of people who are subjected to their policies.
Yeah, you can almost, you know, hear Nancy Pelosi screaming, "Look, guys, just trust us. We know, you know, if only you could just act a little more professionally out there and believe in this neoliberal progressive project. Have faith in us. We can deliver you a post-racial society."
Yeah, it's almost like their fantasy is like just hoping this symbolic gesture would get the black vote, and so we don't have to actually deal with
The black vote is the
actual
obstacle. Right.
problems of the black community. You know, hopefully this will do it.
Right. Yeah. Similar to what they both said, their end goal is this post-racial society where they solve racism and where they represent African culture, but the obstacle is Africans. Yeah.
The problem of the actual experience of
Yeah.
people who have been racialized in America. Right. Yeah, I think a lot of it, you know, it's a more patronizing racism. Right? The obstacle is sort of going back to the meritocracy idea. Like, we have a meritocratic society. Everyone can make it if they want. We have equality of opportunity. You know, if you really pin down a liberal on, you know, questions of racial disparity in America. What they always end up having to admit is that they think that racial others in the United States just don't have, they just need a little more cultural development, right, in order to understand American values a little bit better, succeed in the institutions, and take advantage of the opportunities that are available. Sure, we could try to expand these opportunities. We're trying to do that through legislative efforts, but work with us. It's this very top-down kind of patronizing racism, whereas I think the Donald Trump movement, it sees the racial other as more of a threat, like a power adversary, which is, I think, a qualitative difference between these campuses. Yeah, good. Now, I also don't want to let ourselves off the hook here, because I think what fantasy, the theory of fantasy teaches us, there's no escape from fantasy. And in a way, we always exoticize the other, whether that's a racial other, ethnic other, gender other, whatever. We always exoticize the other in a way. We objectify the other in a way in our fantasies. And we imagine the other as having gained access to the satisfaction that we seek in the fantasy. And I just don't think there's really a way out of this permanently in human subjectivity. And I think this, relates to what I said earlier about how alienation isn't just a problem under capitalism. I think there's a fundamental alienation in the way that we fantasize. We alienate ourselves from each other in fantasy. But there is no escape from fantasy. So what do we do about that, right? This is sort of the deadlock in psychoanalysis. How can you work within this context of this theory of fantasy when we try to develop a revolutionary project? Well, we can talk about that soon. So what is it about the obstacle that's so important for psychoanalysis? Earlier in the class, I talked about the fact that fantasies don't necessarily make us feel good. We have ambivalent feelings about the conflicts that arise in our fantasies. The psychoanalytic term for this ambivalent feeling is enjoyment. That word obviously has a vernacular, kind of common definition, but it has a very technical meaning in psychoanalysis. My friend made an interesting point. He said that the definition sort of rhymes with the common definition, but there's an important difference. And enjoyment in psychoanalysis always refers to these ambivalent feelings that aren't necessarily good or bad. They're sort of both. I wanted to give an example of enjoyment here. Have you guys heard of this influencer Absorbery? He became popular after October 7th last year. He's Palestinian. I think he lives in America. But he puts out these TikTok videos where he trolls Israelis. And he doesn't really ask them tough questions. He just sort of says, "Hi, I'm Palestinian." And they just lose their minds. And I think what it shows us is the way that enjoyment functions in an ideological fantasy. So we're going to watch one of these videos.
Yeah,
You love my videos? You love my videos?
No, I don't love your videos, but not kill me.
Whoa, you just cursed me out in Hebrew. I know that words now. Breathe, bro, breathe. Do you love me?
Okay.
Do you love me?
No, I hate you.
Okay, chill.
Right?
Drink water. You're gonna have a heart attack.
No, I get the heart attack because of you.
Yeah. I don't know why. Are you a fan? Really?
I'm a fan of Israel.
All right, so he's got 50 of these videos that are all very similar. And what they show, right, is it's not a pure hatred that these Israelis on TikTok are exhibiting towards him, right? It's more of an ambivalent feeling that we couldn't describe as purely negative. Let me see, where is this? That one. Yeah. So, the emotional response he gets is this ambivalent response. They hate him, okay, but the hate comes with an excess of emotion that isn't so black and white. And now, I think, in psychoanalytic terms, this is because he functions as a productive obstacle in the anti-Arab fantasies of Israelis. So because of him, they have access to enjoyment. Enjoyment is associated with the fantasy obstacle. And where did they learn that he is their obstacle? From the big other, right? From ideology. So they are enjoying through the obstacle in their ideological fantasy. I think it's worth noting too, we see such excessive violence in this campaign against Gaza by Israel, right? And this animosity towards Palestinians. And this implies that this is not just a cold, calculating political strategic effort, right, by Israel. This is a project driven by racist enjoyment. I think it's the only way to understand it. And I think we need psychoanalysis to understand the full scope of what is happening in Israel today. So enjoyment for psychoanalysis is the fundamental motivating force in our subjectivity. So we do not just seek simple pleasure and meaning as subjects. We seek enjoyment. And enjoyment is not the same as pleasure. We must suffer our enjoyment. It comes from the frustration of contending with the obstacle, not from the pleasure of overcoming it. There's no enjoyment in the attainment of the object of desire. So for psychoanalysis, the object of desire is almost an afterthought. Right? It's the obstacle and the enjoyment associated with the obstacle that's important for subjectivity. So enjoyment, again, involves transgression, right? Oh yeah, please, go for it.
Could you try to define what you mean by subjectivity? Like when you say that enjoyment is, like that enjoyment is fundamental to subjectivity, like what is subjectivity? Like what is it that...
So subjectivity, we crudely defined subjectivity earlier as the experience of being human. So the human experience, human motivation, human drive is centered around the feeling of enjoyment, not necessarily the feeling of pleasure. The psychoanalytic theory of motivation centers enjoyment rather than pleasure as what makes us get out of bed in the morning, basically. And enjoyment always involves transgression. So in the ideological fantasy, we both obey and transgress. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier with the Hegemony Khalif, right-wing backlash. We both obey and transgress. We obey by accepting the object of desire given to us by the big other, and we transgress in our entanglement with the fantasized obstacle, also given to us by the big other. And this obstacle allegedly threatens to undermine the social order. So in other words, the big other offers us both the avowed norms and morals of society, the object of desire, in other words, and an obscene underside of enjoyment via the obstacle. Slavoj Žižek loves this term, obscene underside of enjoyment. So every successful social order includes both of these elements, or it would not function. The obscene underside of enjoyment feels transgressive, but is in fact a solicited transgression. So it is a transgression solicited by the big other. In other words, not at all a transgression. Also in the If We Burn book club, one of the chapters talks about the Paris massacres of 1961. Has anyone heard of this? I did not know about this. So in 1961, there were Algerians living in Paris who were holding protests about the French occupation of Algeria. And the protests became violent. And these were pro-FLN protests. These were not like, I'm not going to sit here and pretend these protests were like, oh, maybe we should leave Algeria. No. They were pro-FLN, which was the Revolutionary National Liberation Movement in Algeria. And they were perceived as a threat by France because they're engaged in this war against the Algerian Liberation Movement. And so Maurice Papon, who was the police commissioner, told his police officers, be subversive in the way that you repress these protests. And on the right, we have an image of the Seine, the river that goes through Paris, where someone had written, here we drown Algerians. Up to 200 to 300 Algerians were killed by the police. Many of them were bound, their arms and legs bound and thrown in the river and drowned. And this was a directive, an explicit directive from the boss of the police. And he actually used the term subversive, be subversive. So the big other desires that we sometimes break its laws to uphold its project. And this going outside of the law for the big other, we can correlate with this obscene underside of enjoyment that we're talking about. Yeah.
So in the context of bringing it back to war crimes perpetrated by Israel or any other like occupying violent army, like the obscene underside of enjoyment here, would that be like excessive cruelty towards civilians, stuff like that?
Yes. Yeah. The Abu Ghraib, prison torture in Iraq. Yeah. I think, what is our theory of that, if not for enjoyment, right? What is the theory? What is the Marxist theory of these crimes? I don't think just limiting ourselves to the realm of ideas, bad ideas, is enough to explain the excessiveness of these transgressions. And what's interesting for psychoanalysis is that they are both transgressions and a deep, deep obedience to the big other. Now, this transgression that is solicited by the big other is what really attaches subjects to ideology. If it weren't for this opportunity to transgress, to get the feeling that we're transgressing, people would not be attached to the social order. They would not follow the dictates of the big other. They didn't have access to this obscene underside of enjoyment. Now, what's important here is that we can never satisfy the desire of the big other enough. So this goes to your point as well. The more we sacrifice for the big other, the more we transgress for the big other to meet its desire, the more it demands from us. There's never a point where we feel like we have met the desire of the big other. Now, I think Israel is a great case in point for this. So, bombing a school is not enough, right? The Hamas terrorist is now lurking inside of a hospital, so you have to bomb the hospital. Now there's a network forming at a refugee camp, so you have to bomb the refugee camp. Now it's a polio vaccine site, right? Now it's, you have to install C4 into pagers, right, and sell them to Hezbollah and blow up 3,000 people at once. The desire is never met, right? There's always more that's being demanded of you when you try to satisfy the desire of the other. I wanted to ask this question. What are some examples you can think of that feel transgressive under capitalism, but that actually really aren't all that transgressive? Charity. Okay. What's transgressive about charity?
Charities will posit themselves as aiding, fixing these ills of society, like homelessness, food insecurity, but in reality, they actually just continue to serve and reproduce this.
Right. They feel like they're doing the dirty work that society isn't going to step up and do, right? But in fact, they're part of the structure of society, of themselves. Yeah.
I don't even want to say it. Maybe we could talk about if it's true or not, but say marching down Pershing Square and doing a big protest. Not that we shouldn't do it, but
Right.
Yeah, protest itself can be kind of a cathartic act of transgression that you can then tell yourself, well, I did that.
I know that within the realm of like media, back then, like Augusto Boal, they talk about how, back then they talk about theater, but it can be applied to movies and other kinds of media as well. And if you're watching a movie that has maybe like revolutionary themes or something about, rising up against the system, and when you watch that, there's an element of catharsis in that. You feel like you're living as the character, and so when the movie's over, when the play is over, that like aggression within you or the need to rebel has somewhat been quelled, and that way you can kind of just move on with the status quo.
Yeah, interesting. That's kind of what Mark Fisher talks about in Capitalist Realism. Right? Like Wall-E is this anti-capitalist film, but then after we're done watching the film, we feel like we've done our anti-capitalism for the day, and we can go back to just being good capitalist subjects. Did I see a hand over here as well? Yeah.
Just kind of what he was saying about charity, like nonprofits and philanthropy. It's like, we got solutions to something that's fundamental to capitalism, and we're going to do it under capitalism. Of course, it's not.
Right. Yeah. The last class used the example of scams. When you're engaged in a scam, you're sort of going outside the law, right? But you're following the greater law at the same time, which is what? Capital accumulation. Right? That's what the big other really wants you to do, even though it would never say in its laws, go out and scam people. We recognize the desire of the big other as asking us to do whatever it takes to, make that dollar. Yeah.
Yes, when we're talking about the big other, I'm wondering how do we define the individuals that actually are central to the capitalist power structure? Like, how do we define somebody like Elon Musk or Joe Biden? Like the people who actually are running society or exercising those influence over society. What are their desires, and are they aware of the fact that they're not this big other? Is it something that kind of reproduces itself on a societal scale without individuals being aware?
Yeah, it's a great question. In psychoanalysis, there's a saying that everyone takes up a position in relation to mastery, or in relation to the proximity of authority. And there are individuals that see themselves as, closer to the heart of that legitimate social authority. But there is no individual, there is no organization, there is no, secret Illuminati club that really is the big other. All of these people themselves are still looking for the big other to tell them what to do. And so in this way, this is why as leftists, I think it's right that we don't say Elon Musk is the enemy. I mean, he's not a friend. We would say capitalism is the enemy. Capitalist social relations, that's the enemy. Elon Musk could be anybody, right? The problem is that he occupies this position in the capitalist order that we all reproduce as capitalist subjects when we recognize him as the CEO of Tesla and we act as though he's this important person. How about like the sheriff's gangs in Los Angeles, right? Sort of transgressive, but not really transgressive. Hazing at college fraternities. It's just sort of this obscene underside that ends up producing figures like John Kerry and George W. Bush. Absolutely not transgressive figures, right? Yeah.
I would have a question about like the idea of what is transgressive. Like, is anything really transgressive then?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to come to that. I'm going to ask you guys that question. Okay, that's a good preview. By the way, I'm hoping we can go till at least 9:10 since we started a little late, but no pressure if you have to leave before that. So there's more examples. The one I thought of the other day is, what about the group chat at your work? I mean, if you are in one, right? Doesn't the group chat kind of function as this underside of gossip and you know, even though you might be attacking your boss in there or something, like, doesn't it kind of help you continue to be a good employee the next day at work because you've gotten that out of your system a little bit? So I think this is also kind of a project of the big others, to give us these outlets to vent and then go back to work. So we believe we fantasize for the object of desire, but in reality we fantasize for the experience of enjoyment. Our fantasies thus contain both conscious and unconscious elements. And enjoyment of the obstacle is what remains unconscious in our fantasy. This is a traumatic fact of fantasy that we have a difficult time admitting to ourselves, except in kind of a detached intellectual way. That we're actually enjoying the obstacle. We don't really believe in the object of desire. But the object of desire does have to be in view. And this is, I think, when social orders start to come under threat, is when the object of desire totally disappears from view. There needs to be a balance between, you know, belief in the possibility of the object of desire satisfying us and in the enjoyment of the obstacle. But I think especially under neoliberalism in America with inflation and just the hellscape that we all live in, the object of desire seems like it's not even close. You know, how many of us are going to be able to afford a house in Los Angeles, right? So an important point about fantasy is that it, you know, the obstacle has to be, you know, we have to believe we could maybe overcome it. It can't just occupy the whole frame. You know, there has to be some idea that we could achieve the object of desire. Okay, now, I said at the beginning that most of these terms in psychoanalysis kind of reflect what we already know. There are some exceptions. There are some kind of esoteric terms in psychoanalysis that we really need to explore to understand their definition. And two of those are the drive and objet. These are jargon terms. So many would agree that early childhood experience plays an overdetermining role in the patterns of our lives as adults. But the primary childhood fantasy relating to, you know, childhood trauma, I think this is the classic idea associated with Freud, conceals a deeper psychic operation that Freud wouldn't discover until 20 years after publishing his main book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And we call this deeper psychic operation the drive, or what Freud called death drive, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So drive's interest is not in fulfilling a desire, even an unconscious kind of primary desire that Freud would have thought of as the thing that really motivates us earlier in his career. Drive's interest is in the satisfaction associated with the failure of desire, with repeating the experience of unfulfillment in the pursuit of desire, with the constant distortion of desire into a symptom that we can enjoy, such as fantasies. This is the project of the drive. So the drive is not actually concerned with objects of desire, only the perpetuation of desire itself. And this produces anxiety, right? Because the trauma of our inherent satisfaction in dissatisfaction is difficult to confront, right? Now, to introduce this other term, objet, Freud thought that while fear has a definite object, right? We could point to Michael Myers as a scary object in the film Halloween. He called the anxiety of the neurotic a free-floating anxiety. So anxiety has no object. Fear has an object. That was Freud's thesis. But Jacques Lacan, who was one of Freud's most important successors, who was a huge influence on Slavoj Žižek, for example, believed that no, anxiety actually does have an object. Anxiety's object is objet. So what is that? I think I have just a confusion. Oh, I was going to talk about Yellowstone there. explain what the next slide is soon. This is a kind of obnoxious diagram of objet A. So, objet A is the obstacle that's inherent to any perceived object of desire. So the aspect of an object itself that resists the ability to be fully understood, to be symbolized in language. And it's this impossibility to fully symbolize an object that actually sets our desire in motion. The objet A we can think of as the most fundamental obstacle in subjectivity and in the displacement that produces fantasy objects. So, Gabe, you talked about how the earth has finite resources, right? So the object of desire of infinite growth itself is a lacking object. There's something about the object of desire for capitalism of infinite growth that the obstacle is bound up in the object of desire itself. The object of desire itself is incomplete. There's a gap in the object of desire. And it's this aspect that we turn into external obstacles in our fantasies. So we take this obstacle that's internal and make it external. This is the process that happens in fantasies. So like Michael Myers, we could think of as the fantasy representation of the objet of suburbia, that kind of haunted background noise of suburbia. We know there's something off about it, right? And our fantasy gives shape to this objet in the form of an obstacle that we can all recognize as such. Another way to look at it, so even when we fulfill some fantasy wish, and Freud thought that every dream, for example, was a wish fulfillment. And Jacques Lacan basically says that dreams and fantasies share the same structure. We find that there's a remainder, there's something left to be desired. And that remainder that we couldn't capture when we got access to the object of desire, that's objet A. It's this thing that escapes us about the object. Now, this is why I wanted to show this picture. So, my friend Justin Garr is a photographer who just put out this book called Empire. And it's a photo book. And this one caught my eye, this picture. He said he was standing on this balcony trying to capture this picture forever, and he finally got the opportunity. At first, we look at this photo and we think, wow, that's, what a relaxing vacation for these people. And then you look closer and you're like, that actually doesn't look all that relaxing. Like this guy on the left, there's nowhere for him to put his drink. He's using his forearm as a pillow. The angle of these beach chairs is never right? The back support's never quite there. The guy on the far right is really struggling with that. You pointed out this woman's feet it just doesn't look comfortable, the way she's positioned her feet there. And then the book she's reading is almost totally darkened by, the low light in this corner of the pool area they've been forced into, right? So even the dream vacation, especially the dream vacation for most of us who aren't rich, ends up, being very disappointing. And it comes with all these things that we didn't quite anticipate about this object of desire. So I think that this, the inherent failure of any notion like the American dream produces the need for a narrative to explain the fantasy's failure to satisfy. And it's objet A that is always, the inherent obstacle that prevents us from really getting satisfaction from any object of desire. And so we come up with fantasies to explain why this is the case. In his interpretation of dreams, Freud conceives of the unconscious as the indestructible element of the human soul, containing an indestructible wish. And I really like this idea of the indestructible wish, which expresses itself in every symptom and thus in every dream. Now, with the insight of Lacan, we could conceive of this indestructible element of the human soul as the drive, and its indestructible wish as objet. So where does objet come from? I hesitate to show this tweet because it's not the clearest thing to try to understand, but I think it does give you some insight into the kind of poetic way that psychoanalysis is written about. And it takes many passes over a text to really understand what is being conveyed sometimes. So maybe we can try it. Can anyone read this for us? We have a volunteer.
Lacan has the idea that in analysis, we discover like 5 words that form cobwebs in our unconscious, and we repeat them, but not always directly the same way as words. Rather, we repeat them as they sound, phenomenally. This is a good way, I think, to understand what a signifier is.
Okay, thank you. So objet, I think for psychoanalysis, is, it comes from the trauma of our subjection into language. And for me, my reading of this is that these 5 words are the 5 sounds that we originally, it could be 5, could be whatever. We originally recognized these sounds as words, and we resisted them as babies. We knew that something was going to be taken away from us if we allowed ourselves to be subjects of language. And I think that, that's one way to read this. When we are subjected into language, we lose something about ourselves, right? Because language can never fully capture the essence of something. There's always a remainder. There's always something that escapes representation. And that's a traumatic thing. When you submit to language, you submit to symbolic castration, right? You give away something about yourself when you agree to be a part of a society with language and symbolization. There's conflicting theories in psychology about why it is that 2-year-olds who, a week ago could only say like 3 words, suddenly come out with full sentences and words that you didn't even know they knew. And, cognitive psychology has this theory of latent learning. That, well, babies are learning, even when they're not demonstrating it in their behavior. I think maybe they're resisting language because they know that it takes away the thing that is sublime about life, about our desire when we are forced into signification. And I wanted to tie this to this concept of alienation that we were talking about. If someone else could volunteer to read this one for us. Yeah, go for it.
We can see now why castration is symbolic. By means of it, the subject exchanges his being an object for a place in the symbolic exchange, for a signifier which represents him. Conceived in this way, castration is strictly homologous to alienation, not only in the Lacanian sense of alienation in the signifier's order, but also in the Marxian sense of alienation, which pertains to the status of a proletariat. The proletariat is deprived of the very kernel of his being, of his productivity, of the surplus value brought about by it. And in exchange for it, he gets what? He is himself reduced to labor force, an exchangeable object commodity that can be bought on the market.
Yeah, thank you. So language kind of proletarianizes the subject, is sort of what he's saying here. It takes away this surplus aspect that can't be crafted by language about the subject. It's a bad bargain, right, for the subject. But there is no escape from this. There is no escape from the symbolic structure. And, a lot of the things we associate with Freud are like, oh, you had a specific childhood trauma that defines who you are, but maybe someone else had a different childhood trauma or didn't have much trauma. That's not what Lacanian psychoanalysis is saying. I also don't think that's what Freud was really saying. I think what Lacanian psychoanalysis is saying is everybody goes through the trauma of being subjected into language. And the way we respond to that is what ends up determining the way we fantasize, basically. That this lack brought about by language, this symbolic castration, demands that we come up with fantasy narratives to respond to this trauma. And we construct obstacles in our fantasies that pave over this fundamental alienation that we have a very difficult time confronting face to face. I hope this is a very difficult concept, okay? It won't make sense right away today, but I wanted to open the door so you guys can kind of understand what some of the problems are in psychoanalysis that we're trying to address. Yeah.
How do you spell that? I'm just confused.
Yeah,
It's
it's
like object A in French.
it is the direct translation I think is object O, which is object other. But yeah, object A I think is how it's often translated, or object petit a. But object A is typically how I've seen it written. Object little a, objet petit a. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this objet a. I have some examples that I could give, but I kind of want to open it up more to a discussion with you guys. Now, given everything we've talked about in the structure of fantasy, is there anything radical to be found even in a conservative fantasy? So are these ideological fantasies just ideological, in other words? And relatedly, what if we wanted to construct a radical fantasy? Are there examples already out there, even in Hollywood, of radical fantasies? So I wanted to just open this up to you guys, if you had an answer to either of these questions.
I feel like a radical fantasy would locate capitalism as the obstacle.
Okay. Would we not be enjoying capitalism in that case? I don't know. That's kind of an annoying question. But yeah, right. I mean, I think you're onto something there. Like, rather than just, positing a racial other or a lazy, right, obstacle as the person stopping us from getting this capitalist object. Maybe what if we switch capitalism actually into the position of obstacle? I think that is interesting. Yeah.
Do you mean enjoyment in like the psychoanalytical way?
Yeah.
But couldn't that be kind of a negative emotion then?
Yeah, right. It is ambivalent, right? So it's not just that we would have positive feelings about capitalism, but it's also the prime motivating force. And isn't the all the complexity of capitalism itself, isn't that already kind of an obstacle in the way we fantasize now? Even if we wouldn't name it necessarily. But maybe you're saying naming it as capitalism itself would be a progressive, radical step in the way we fantasize. That's interesting.
I think the question is interesting if you read it as like, what would the fantasy of someone who considers themselves a radical be? Or if you consider like very literally like a radical fantasy, like you think of the root of the fantasy, it is like the subject. And so like I guess a radical fantasy, like if you're going back to the root and you're killing yourself, it'd be something like an existential crisis or even just like a non-existence or like a death in a way.
Yeah, so maybe a radical fantasy would be, look, I'm not interested in the big other's idea of what an obstacle is, the big other's idea of what I should desire is. I want to get in touch with my fundamental alienation as a human subject. Yeah, I think that is sort of the direction that someone like Slavoj Žižek would go.
So being kind of looser with the term radical, I would argue a lot of the conservative fantasy is because they involve basically getting rid of law, getting rid of the Constitution, getting rid of democracy, overthrowing all that so that they could, kill people that don't look like them and whatnot.
Right. Okay, so there is a willingness to totally subvert the existing social order, right, in order to get the thing they want.
Yeah, I don't know if they look at it that way, right? That's basically what they're saying.
Because like sometimes I see even like billionaires see themselves as victims and want to subvert somehow, the things they see as their obstacles. So I don't think that could ever be a fantasy that could serve like society. They're just thought they could only be obstacles, but I think an actual radical fantasy would be something more utopia-like.
Yeah, and Zizek himself actually calls for kind of a return to utopian thinking in a lot of his lectures, which is a provocative thing to say, but I think it's interesting.
So, talking about the second question, would a radical fantasy in that sense include stuff like the Hunger Games or Mad Max or just any of these that have changed the social order?
So why the Hunger Games? What would be radical about that? I saw that more recently because they aired it at Power.
I haven't seen that recently, so if anyone else wants to.
Well, I kind of see the United States as kind of like,
The Hunger Games.
Yeah, I mean, even like charter schools or things like you got to win the lottery, kind of like to really be here, right? Like it's a very strange, and people go with it. It's like I'd rather have a chance to win than make sure everybody has the thing, the service. So
There's an interesting point in the film where President Snow, is that his name? Donald Sutherland. He asks the goth guy from American Beauty, what's his name? He's also in Yellowstone. I forget the actor, but he's kind of his protege coming up in the government. He's like, do you know why there's a winner to the Hunger Games? And he says, hope is why. And he's like, you can't let there be too much hope, but there also needs to be some hope. Kind of like what we said earlier about the object of desire has to be in view for fantasy to function. And that's what kind of keeps the thing going, right? People believe that one day they maybe could be that person that makes it. And that's enough to let them enjoy all the suffering that is involved in not making it. But in even a conservative fantasy, we said earlier that fantasy emerges from the lack in the big other, the failure of the symbolic structure to be identical with itself, to actually be a smooth functioning system. There's always a lack in ideology that requires fantasy and requires our efforts to pave over. And I think it's the lack in the authority, the lack in the social authority that's inherent in any fantasy that makes any fantasy potentially radical. Because what you're enjoying is the failure of capitalism, right? So there is that radical kernel to any fantasy, even the most conservative fantasies. What about go for it.
I mean, if fantasies are truly never able to fully satisfy us, would a radical fantasy be placing the subject as the obstacle?
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah.
To, dismantle even the system.
I am the obstacle, right?
Of the fantasy itself.
I don't get to just externalize the obstacle into some other. Right? I am wrapped up in the obstacle. And yeah, I think that is a lot of the way that psychoanalysis tries to conceive of what a radical fantasy would look like, is implicating yourself in the obstacle rather than blaming some other for being the obstacle in your fantasy. And that, this is why I like, a book came out recently called, I forget the title, but it's a collection of Castro's speeches. I think DJ Prashad edited the book. And you can hear Castro is like blaming the party himself for a lot of the failures of like Cuban sugar production, for example. He's like, guys, I can't blame anyone else. Like, we did our best, and we weren't good enough, And I think that is, I want to talk about this soon with the next question to ask you guys, but implicating ourselves in the obstacle, implicating our own revolutionary project as its own obstacle, and what we're trying to achieve, I think, is a radical gesture. I was hoping people would say, like, more TV shows that are already out there. That we got Hunger Games, that's good. Fallout. Oh, you think Fallout might be a radical?
Yeah, in a way, right? It's like a nuclear winter, right?
What's the basics? I played the video game. I haven't seen the show yet.
Basically, the show is like it's after everything's happened, and society operates in a very different way now. Kind of back to they have like the old West character, and they even have like night characters. So all the past is coming out.
In what way is that radical?
Well, just like that, the social order has been subverted. Right. Yeah.
Right. Right. So it's acknowledging the failure of capitalist society, right? At the very outset.
Yeah. I was just thinking of the parable of the sower. People always talk about that when they try to think of like something in the future that can be possible for radical people to survive and stick together. It doesn't sound very like, we're going to have all these luxuries or we're going to have beautiful cohesion amongst lots of people, but it's something that still people kind of hold on to because I guess because of the grim conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think not trying to posit some beautiful, kind of unattainable reality, but rather, getting us closer to our solidarity in a condition of alienation, right? Something like that.
Yeah, I think, like, kind of explaining what you said, like, I think perhaps the reason why things like post-apocalyptic things like, The Last of Us or Fallout or these fictional shows about people surviving together in post-apocalyptic environments, perhaps part of why that appeals is exactly because it offers the object of desire, which is community and being together, and the obstacle, but because it is in this gritty, like non-utopian setting, it doesn't feel too fake. It still feels within the grasp of the grimness and the darkness of reality that to achieve that. I'm not sure if I communicated this correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Is that a hand? Okay. I always expect someone to bring up Andor. I think I've had to bring it up both times. But yeah, I think Andor shows a cool dynamic where, there's obviously a revolutionary project in the show, but there's also, for me, one of the more potentially radical figures in the show is actually one of the kind of true believers of the Empire. Cyril Karn is the character's name. And he appears as this absolutely conservative figure who truly believes in the project of the Empire and will do anything. He'll go above and beyond, right, for the big other. But when you compare him to his coworkers, they're always they have bad posture and they don't really want to do anything. He asked them to figure out who killed these two officers, and they're like, we're gonna have to look through all that footage. They have this sort of cynical detachment. And I think this is one of the things Mark Fisher and Slavoj Žižek are very critical of. They think is absolutely ideological, is this cynical detachment that we have as we still do our jobs for ideology, for the big other. But this absolute commitment to the big other, I think could lead a character like that to see the failure of the empire. He takes it to its logical endpoint. Oh, okay, the empire says it's this cohesive, social whole, but look at what it's actually doing versus what it's trying to say it's doing. Like if he actually confronted what the rebellion is saying, as he pursues its leaders. Someone with that level of commitment is more likely to see the failure of the logical endpoint of the social project that he's committed to. So I think that is sort of an aspect of Andor that's radical. I wanted to ask, you guys got to go. Oh, okay, just scratching. Okay. I wanted to get to this question too before we go. I won't don't ignore all that, unfortunately. Now, we said that the obscene underside is always a solicited transgression in the context of some social authority, of the big other. But is there potentially an obscenity that we could introduce into a fantasy that would be difficult for the big other to absorb, that would threaten the status, the legitimacy of the big other? You know, what might such an obscenity be? If I can ask the question.
I guess.
Yeah. Go for it, yeah.
Like rejecting the logic of the big other.
What would that look like in practice?
So like in practice, right, things cost money. So if you open a restaurant and the food is free, then it's like that would be rejecting the capitalist big other because it cannot absorb, like you're fundamentally disrupting the logic that a commodity has to be paid for at the point of sale.
And that a restaurant should exist in order to make money. So yeah, not participating in some of these rituals that define the reproduction of the big other. Yeah.
I would say, that there is a certain line where you reach the goal between just being countercultural, being legitimately revolutionary. If you look at like the 1960s, for example, you had this whole countercultural movement culturally, which was generally tolerated by the big others in terms of like music, drug culture, stuff like that, the hippie movement. But then you also had certain undercurrents that were legitimately revolutionary, or you had, American imperialism being challenged by college students, for example, which is like the Kent State shooting. You had people who were kind of going to a point where this can no longer be tolerated within the framework of kind of democratic discussion. So the National Guard was put in, and people were killed. These things was present on it. With the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was tolerated for a time. Of course, he was assassinated as well. But a lot of this, the civil rights movement was generally tolerated by the government. But when the Black Panthers moved towards radical militant action towards the American state, Cohen's Pro was created. Very harsh methods were taken into account in order to suppress this movement by any means necessary.
Yeah, we can get a clue when we look at the level of repression that meets some of these obscene anti-capitalist gestures, right? Like COINTELPRO. That might be a sign that we're on the right track. Yeah, was there a hand up here? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And to go off that, it's like you almost want to investigate where those ruptures were. Why did they have to kill Malcolm X at that moment? Why did they have to kill Martin Luther King? Why did the Black Panthers or the Black Liberation Army or the Weathermen get so violently suppressed, as opposed to the 400,000 people marching on Washington against the Vietnam War? That wasn't that violently suppressed. So it takes more investigation. I don't know the answer outright, but there's something there they were doing that could have caused a rupture, at least in the other's mind, right?
Right. Did you have your hand up over here? Yeah.
I guess just anything that works to dismantle the big other's ability to reproduce itself. Because it's my understanding that MLK was killed pretty shortly after he became against the Vietnam War. And so I guess maybe this is sort of just what I think now, but maybe it's you can draw a pretty logical conclusion from okay, American imperialism in Vietnam is bad to the existence of America is bad, etc. Like he had the ability to mobilize people in a way that others didn't.
Right. Yeah. He was touching on something that it was difficult for America to accept that kind of critique and still function as a coherent social whole.
Yeah, I feel like there are like some fundamental like pillars to capitalism that I think can be threatened. Like it really does feel like an actual transgression against the big other, like promoting equality through class and race, or not allowing like international exploitation of countries and the growth economy, like not going by that kind of those kind of things or those values, threatening those values in like America or something in the minds of people. I think those things can really like change the larger structure.
Yeah, I always think about this when they were trying to build that giant telescope in Hawaii on native land there a few years back. It was like 5 years ago. And the logic of the people resisting that was not like, well, we do want big telescopes, just not right here. We know you need to do your space program and NASA, all that's important, but like just not right here. They're like, we actually don't care that much about your project. And you can't do that here. Like, we're not interested in your project. We're not interested in what you consider to be scientific productivity. That's not what we think of as productivity. Yeah, I think that's kind of, in a way, just rejecting the big other, the gaze of the big other, the concerns of the big other, and not taking them on as your own. Yeah.
I have a question. Why do we need to resist the big other? And also, I guess it's like multiple questions, and then like, is the identification of capitalism as like the big other, the work of another other, and then is it like once we resist this big other, are we going to resist the next big other? Is it just like, why are we resisting the big other?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important. This is another point where we kind of have to accept alienation as fundamental to human subjectivity. There will always be a big other. I think the question is, how do we relate to the big other? Are we so lost in ideological fantasies that we really believe in the big other as this entity out there that's a real authority, that somebody could actually embody that authority? Or do we all have a bit more of a sense of humor about the big other? Like, we recognize that there really isn't an authority that we can turn to for all the answers. That it's only as good as ourselves reproducing it. And so what sort of big other should we produce? If we're going to take responsibility for this as a fact of human, of the human psyche, of the human experience, of subjectivity, what sort of big other should we collectively produce together? And I think that, did someone else have another point or hand that I missed or anything? I think my answer here, to take it back to the beginning of this talk, wouldn't just the notion that the poor can govern itself be a very subversive idea under capitalism? That the poor can govern not just themselves, but all of society, right? Not just, be leaders in trade unions or communes somewhere, but that the poor can actually dominate society and make decisions that affect the rich. That the poor can subject the rich to a different form of enjoyment. That they can get the rich involved in a fantasy that is the product of the poor's labor, like the poor's own efforts in their political project. That, I think, is a real transgression that capitalism cannot absorb. The dictatorship of the proletariat, in other words. Now, I think part of what that would look like, to get back to your point about isn't there always a big other, beyond the big other? This would mean, if the poor really took responsibility for running society, there would not be some other authority that they could blame the failure of society, right? If this historical development actually took place, which it is taking place in certain places. I think the Cuban Family Code of a couple of years ago is an example of this. Thousands and thousands of meetings, discussions, polls, feedback from community members went into producing what ended up becoming the Cuban Family Code, which reframed what families could look like beyond the nuclear family. It also came with all sorts of benefits for different types of caregivers, like grandparents would get paid for taking care of grandchildren, for example. If this fails in some way, and it inevitably will, it's never going to be perfect. Cuban people can't point to some other enemy and say, oh, well, they did it wrong, or something like that. Of course, there are obstacles that are out of their control, right? American imperialism. But I think what would make it a revolutionary project is accepting responsibility for the failure of the project and to allow the constant failure of the project to fuel new iterations of the project, to fuel the further development of the project, that those contradictions can continue to develop within the project and no one points to some substantial external obstacle as the reason why their project isn't working out. And I think this is why a lot of, on the left, we have a lot of fantasies that aren't actually very radical because we have all these reasons for why we're marginal, right? And it is very rarely the case that we're blaming ourselves for our marginality. It's almost always some other that we construct as in the figure of obstacle that we are enjoying, right? We're enjoying our marginality through whatever we imagine as the obstacle to our success. So that would be kind of my answer to this. What could be an obscenity that the big other could not absorb? And I think I'll leave it there. It's 9:10. Thanks everybody for participating. Thanks for coming out.